You all successfully sprung forward. Remember back in the day before cell phones when you actually had to like remember, the world has become so much easier and so much harder. And here we are. Well, and I noticed that the distance from my eyes to the lectern has also become much greater than it used to be. I refuse to wear readers. I refuse. And I have to skedaddle pretty much right after assembly for to do some family caregiving. So if I'm seeming to run out of here like bat out of hell, don't take it personally. So I shared the poem I'm about to read with my Prajna class in January, but it's such a lovely poem and one that I have come to really be fond of. So I'm gonna share it here again, and if you've heard this one before, oh well. It's a poem. Many times can be heard. And it's a poem that is about what we all are, which is broken, and about what we all are, which is whole. It's called Breakage. It's by Mary Oliver, and I'm going to read it twice. It's not a long poem. Breakage. I go down to the edge of the sea. How everything shines in the morning light. The cusp of the whelk, the broken cupboard of the clam, the opened blue mussels, moon snails, pale pink and barnacle scarred, and nothing at all whole or shut, but tattered, split, dropped by the gulls onto the gray rocks and all the moisture gone. It's like a schoolhouse of little words, thousands of words. First, you figure out what each one means by itself. The jingle, the periwinkle, the scallop full of moonlight. Then you begin slowly to read the whole story. I go down to the edge of the sea. How everything shines in the morning light. The cusp of the whelk, the broken cupboard of the clam, the opened blue mussels, moon snails, pale pink and barnacle scarred, and nothing at all whole or shut, but tattered, split, dropped by the gulls onto the gray rocks and all the moisture gone. It's like a schoolhouse of little words, thousands of words. First, you figure out what each one means by itself. The jingle, the periwinkle, the scallop full of moonlight. Then you begin slowly to read the whole story. So on some level, today's talk is about learning how to read. And I love when the ocean appears in Mary Oliver's poems. It's a different ocean than the ocean I now have come to love. It's the Atlantic Ocean, not the Pacific Ocean. Although I did grow up having my parents drag me against my will to Cape Cod every summer. We lived in Chicago, so that was like a major expenditure of time and energy to go to Cape Cod every summer, but they kept fantasizing that we were going to move back to Boston, which we never did. But anyway, I digress. The ocean, right? I've come since living in Oregon to realize that the ocean is my favorite place. And I think where I really fell in love with the ocean was back in the day. Has anyone ever been to Sylvia Beach Hotel in Newport? They used to have this incredible deal where you could rent a bed in their dorm, and it was like $26 a night, and it came with free breakfast. They don't have this deal anymore, but back in the day. And the dinner, if you paid the extra money to have dinner, you'd be seated, and this is still the case. I think I haven't been there in a long time. You're seated at these tables, and do they still play the game?
They don't play the game.
They don't play the game anymore? What? Oh my gosh. The world keeps it changing. Okay, so they used to play this game. The game is called Two Truths and a Lie. And that's the title of my talk today, Two Truths and a Lie. My husband, Ezra, is brilliant at this game. So Two Truths and a Lie, it's very simply, it's a way like a break the ice kind of game. You go around the table and everybody tells two truths and a lie, but you don't reveal what is the truth and what is the lie. And then you're trying to outwit the other people at the table, right? 2 truths and a lie about your life. So my husband would tell, one of his standards was to say, okay, I've had a lot of jobs. I helped to artificially inseminate turkeys in Ireland. I delivered human cremains through the US Postal Service. So those are 2 truths. And I also helped deliver babies in the Alaskan bush. 2 truths and a lie. I'll leave you guys to figure out which is the lie here. So 2 truths and a lie, the title of my talk today. And the 2 truths that I want to talk about are actually not so much content, but about paradigms of truths, like 2 types of truth that seem to be the prevailing understanding of the 2 paradigms we have for understanding what is true, what is real, what is sound, what is good in our culture today. And indeed, this sense that our culture is completely split between these 2 types of truth, just like the clam shells or the mussel shells in Mary Oliver's poem are split like a broken mouth, split in half, unable to articulate together, that we're torn between these 2 truths. So we have a close, very, very close family friend who has, as this may be true in your circle of friends or in your family, and more these days I'm hearing people talk about this in their lives, this really close family friend has come to believe all manner of very, very strange narratives about the world, follower of QAnon, and it's heartbreaking, right? And what do? You know, you sort of try to, I watch my husband have these conversations, I overhear them, or I hear about them afterwards, these conversations of like, but there's this and there's this and there's this, you know, all the evidence that you can bring forth to break through the narrative. And the more he does that, or any of the other family members who are close with this person, the more he does it, the more those bits of evidence, those facts, those articles, those statements, the more they actually confirm to this friend that there's a cover-up going on. Like the more evidence, the more it confirms, right? Is this a familiar phenomenon? Mm-hmm. And the friend's just like, you know, that's just yet more proof that there's a cover-up. There's an article you may have seen, April of last year, came out in the Atlantic. I mean, this has been so widely talked about in the media and everywhere. An article about the big lie, about folks saying the election didn't, you know, was a scam, that Trump won, all this stuff, right? And the reporter talked to various people, and the sentiments, these again, I'm stating this out loud because I mean, this is familiar stuff, I think, but I'm trying to pinpoint, not the content here. I mean, that's stuff we could talk about in many, many ways, but I'm trying to pinpoint these 2 paradigms of truth, right? And so this reporter, names and details matter. Her name is Sarah Longwell. It came out in April of 2022 in the Atlantic. She says that she talked to a woman from Wisconsin who was an election denier, and said, I can't really put my finger on it, but something just doesn't feel right. Just no, in my gut. A man from Pennsylvania said something about it, the election, just didn't seem right. A man from Arizona said it didn't smell right. That very, very, very powerful sense, internal sense, that there's something rotten here. And then one supporter she met said, I think what convinced me more that the election was fixed than anything else was how vehemently they have said it wasn't. Right? Okay, so this logic. So, you know, on the one hand, one paradigm. Here are observable empirical facts. Here's evidence details. We can fact check. We can sort this out. We can observe. We can use a critical reasoning. We can get to a narrative about what happened. On the other side of paradigm of truth, it says there's an unshakable inward conviction here. Okay, 2 paradigms. One, how we talk about stuff through empirical evidence, build a narrative, build an understanding. The other is my narrative rests on this unshakable inward conviction. Okay? Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, on some level, this is one of the oldest dichotomies in the modern world. This is the dichotomy of faith and science. It's not perennial. This doesn't go back forever. I mean, there are versions of a similar dichotomy that we can trace back all through recorded history. But faith versus science, this is a dichotomy with a specific historical trajectory. It goes back to, okay, a trip down academic memory lane. It goes back to the period that I used to teach about and study at the university. It goes back to the early modern period. It goes back to, for instance, like Galileo Galilei being put on trial in the 17th century by the Catholic Church for saying that the earth revolves around the sun. And he said, "Eppure si muove." That's my Italian moment for the day. Yes, but it moves. However, it moves. The earth moves, he said. But he was still condemned by the church. Right? Faith versus science. But what's changed in that tension between those two, what's changed, what seems new to our moment, is the anguish that has arisen. The sense that this isn't just like, you know, two different tracks, but these are two parallel universes, that there's no way to talk across this broken clamshell divide. Does that seem familiar? Does it resonate? So it's not just faith versus reason. I mean, I was thinking back to a film and a book that's been discussed in this very Dharma hall at least twice. So Carl Sagan's book, Contact. This is a recurring. Hojo-san has talked about this film. I've talked about this film with Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey. Right. A great film, great book. I think published maybe in the 80s or 90s. It looks so naive and sweet now. Carl Sagan is talking all about faith and science, and it's like he's working in a world where you could actually write a book where the two like are okay together somehow. There's a lovely quote from the book. I can't remember who says this, but the quote is, "We all have a thirst for wonder. It's a deeply human quality. Science and religion are both bound up in it. We all have a thirst for wonder. It's a deeply human quality. Science and religion, science and faith are both bound up in it." So not that long ago, we could have a bestseller and a movie that kind of in this beautiful way harmonizes faith and science, but it seems like now, right, we can't harmonize the two. And I call this talk Two Truths and a Lie. That's the lie. The lie is that we are so broken that we can't speak across this divide. That's the lie. Because the lie here is that what's tearing us apart is two different versions of truth. But what's tearing us apart is not two different versions of truth, but a single shared vision, a single shared insistence on leverage, on the leverage that comes from the individual self understood as the fulcrum of the world. Because here's the thing, tripping down academic memory lane again, same period, Galileo, right? Early modern period, is actually the origin of this image of the self as the fulcrum. There's something really interesting that both of these modern versions of faith and science, they come from the exact same place. They emerge from the exact same root. So just prior to the 16th century, 17th century, that the generation before that, before the moment when faith and science take this divide, the moment right before that, I'm sorry, this is academic, but hopefully this is helpful. The moment before that, Italian Renaissance, Italian humanism, Leonardo da Vinci, man is the measure of all things. Have you ever seen that Da Vinci drawing? It's called Vitruvian Man, of the splayed figure, arms out, legs out, this five-pointed star, and then it's like the human figure is in a compass, right? Like literally, man is the measure of all things. Leonardo, fabulous, right? A generation later, we have the emergence of this great fear and doubt. Like, wait, man is the measure of all things? That's a pretty shaky basis to build a world upon. And that skepticism breeds, on the one hand, someone like Francis Bacon, who's often called the father of modern science. And Francis Bacon, he writes, "It is a false assertion," he writes, "that the sense of man is the measure of things." So he's directly refuting that, like optimism. He's like, that's false, he says. On the contrary, all perceptions, as well of the sense as of the mind, so all the perceptions that come to us through our thinking or through our 5 empirical senses, are according to the measure of the individual and not according to the measure of the universe. So if man is the measure of all things, that's right. Then like I'm like reading the world through a Myobun lens. And Bacon is saying, oh, that's kind of problematic, folks. He says, the human understanding is like a false mirror. It's a cloudy lens, he says, which receiving rays irregularly distorts and discolors the nature of things by mingling its own nature with it. So Bacon, the father of modern science, what he's saying is, wait a second, if man is the measure of all things, this is a very broken measure. And so the scientific method comes out of that recognition and says, okay, broken measure, now what? Let's actually, and he talks about this in terms of, he talks about our biases, our assumptions, all the ways in which we see the world through a faulty lens. And he says, let's clear ourselves of those idols, he calls them. Let's squeegee the lens that we are. And so the scientific method, this inductive method that says, let's look at particulars, let's gather evidence. Bacon comes up with a way of talking about what we call experiment. Like, let's set experiments. Let's do our best to take in data. Let's turn this faulty subjective lens into a solid support for objective truth. So you see that move? We're starting with the self. The self is faulty, but starting with the self, let's do everything we can. Critical thinking. Let's do everything we can to become a good basis for objective fact. So the scientific method emerges out of this recognition that the self is faulty, and now we have to do what we can to be objective. So that's the science side. The faith side, Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation, similarly says, hey, the self is a faulty measure. Talking about faith, he says, faith is not what people think it is. Their human dream is a delusion. Because they observe that faith is not followed by good works or better life, they fall into error, even though they speak and hear much about faith. Faith is not enough, they say. So what he's grappling with here is, he says, look, people think, I have faith, I believe in God, and yet we see that those people commit terrible things. So clearly faith isn't enough. Clearly you need to do good in the world. Martin Luther says, no, that's not right. He says, what they call faith is not true faith. It's just a human fabrication. It's human beliefs. It's what Bacon, some years later, will call idols. It's just our mistaken assumption. He says, they think that when you hear the gospel, you start working, creating by your own strength a thankful heart, which says, I believe. That is what they think true faith is. But because this is a human idea, a dream, the heart never learns anything from it. So it does nothing. And reform doesn't come from this faith either. Instead, faith is God's work in us that changes us and gives new birth from God. Faith is a living, Luther says, a living, bold trust in God's grace, so certain of God's favor that it would risk death 1,000 times trusting in it. Martin Luther's vision of faith, this inward, unshakable confidence, this sense of, I just know what's right. Not because I created it with my human faulty mind, but because God instilled it in me. So that unshakable confidence, faith is this inward, unshakable confidence, which is analogous. In fact, it's the actual same thing as God's grace working in us. That comes from the same source as Bacon's trust in the scientific method. It comes from a recognition that, oh, man is we just got our faulty lens here. Now what? Faith, science. Okay. Does this make sense? So the unshakable confidence is what animates those who say, I just know. But the scientific method also knows how to know. So these two visions of truth, both are finding a way to a solid sense of, I know how to know, that is nonetheless built out of a subjective experiential reality. How do I get from the subject to objective truth? Both are doing the same thing. So two different truths which come strangely from the same place. Both come from a concern that the self is not alone a solid foundation upon which to build, and both seek to establish in the midst of that skepticism a solid foundation. Both come from skepticism and from a concern about the self as the foundation of everything. In the terms of Mary Oliver's poem, both want to take our brokenness, right, our incompleteness, and nonetheless read the whole story. But this is perhaps the problem. This effort to make the self the origin of that story and the fulcrum of the world is to think somehow that the self can overcome its own partiality, its own brokenness, that we can move from our brokenness to wholeness, that we can do it from this broken self. I want to propose another viewpoint, and this is the viewpoint of the Buddha way. Surprise, surprise. The Buddhist up here wants to talk about a middle way, not a middle way, so another way. A viewpoint that we may call following our ancestors. We may call it the backward step. All right, so I'm going to read a longish, not so long, about that big, passage from Ongshi, 12th century predecessor, immediate predecessor to the founder of our school in Japan, Dogen Zenji, and really the source of the first deep articulation of this practice we do here all the time, this practice of Zazen, of taking the backward step, sitting upright, and being here. And one way, before I read the Hongji, one way I want to frame this, I'm sort of reiterating the same thing I just said, but seeing if this maybe makes it click or cling in a different way. What if wholeness, instead of our brokenness leading us to wholeness, what if wholeness is the source of our brokenness? Okay? Well, what if source and result, cause and effect, are not so separate? So this is a collection of Hongshi's teachings that Taigen Bin Leighton put together called Cultivating the Empty Field. And this is a passage from his practice instructions, a passage called The Backward Step and the Upright Cauldron. The upright cauldron, the cauldron is an image of this sitting upright and this sort of alchemical activity of our upright being in Chinese thought. With the depths clear, utterly silent, thoroughly illuminate the source, empty and spirited, vast and bright. Even though you have lucidly scrutinized your image and no shadow or echo meets it, searching throughout, you see that you will have distinguished between the merits of 100 undertakings. Then you must take the backward step and directly reach the middle of the circle from where light shines forth. I'm going to read a little bit more, but let me say a little bit about this backward step. So if we think about the movement, both of faith and science, those two visions of truth that I've just delineated, if we think about that movement as a movement forward from the self toward wholeness, right? Either from the unshakable confidence of faith or from the movement of science, this is about moving forward a base of knowledge into the world, into action. This backward step, like, what does it mean, though, if instead of trying to illuminate a world of activity and objects to survey its wholeness, what if there's something like stepping backward into the very center of that enlightening activity. Then you must take the backward step and directly reach the middle of the circle from where light shines forth. Outstanding and independent, still you must abandon pretext for merit. Carefully discern that naming engenders beings and that these rise and fall with intricacy. All the ways we try to move from self to object, to name the world, like Adam in creation, naming all of the beings, like Mary Oliver articulating all of the names of the bits and pieces of her world. Carefully discern that naming engenders being and that these rise and fall with intricacy. When you can share yourself, then you may manage affairs and you have the pure seal. My eyes. Talk about the light. And you have the pure seal that stamps the 10,000 forms. Traveling the world, meeting conditions, the self joyfully enters samadhi in all delusions and accepts its function, which is to empty out the self so as not to be full of itself. Oh, there's so much to say here, which I'm just not going to say it because we'll talk about this more. The empty valley receives the clouds. The cold stream cleanses the moon, not departing and not remaining. Far beyond all the changes, you can give teachings without attainment or expectation. Everything everywhere comes back to the olden ground. Not a hair has been shifted, bent, or raised up. Despite 100 uglinesses or 1,000 stupidities, the upright cauldron, this embodied posture, is naturally beneficent. Shoshu's answers, wash out your bowl and drink your tea, do not require making arrangements. From the beginning, they have always been perfectly apparent. He's referencing a couple of koans here. If this is like piquing your interest, just kind of a little teaser, in the ethics class, the Sheila class I'm going to be teaching in April, we'll be starting with this passage from Hongxi. Thoroughly observing each thing with the whole eye is a patch-robed monk's spontaneous conduct. Thoroughly observing each thing with the whole eye is a patch-robed monk's spontaneous conduct. That one sentence is kind of that's the sentence for me today. This idea that instead of trying to see the wholeness of the world, what does it mean to see with a whole eye? Okay, not to see the world as whole, but to have this eye be whole, which, as far as I know right now in my life, that's just about being me, completely me, all me, like trying my best to bring my whole self here, which means like checking my privilege and seeing my blind spots, which of course I will never see, but thankfully I have Sangha to point them out to me. I have my husband to point them out to me. Seeing with the whole eye rather than trying to illuminate a whole world. Right? The more I encounter this question of these two truths, faith and science, how do we speak to each other? The more I realize that that question is all about knowing. How do I know? How do I construct a whole world and say, this is what it is? How do I have objective truth? And actually, this seeing with the whole eye, this isn't about knowing. This is about living. This is not about knowledge, attainment. This is about, well, what our ancestors called Shila. This is about conduct, about how to live in the world, how to meet the world completely moment by moment. So how do we do that? I was talking to a friend that I adore the other day. She's not an election denier, but she is, in my mind, like making this huge mistake. And we had this conversation where I was like, have you ever had these moments with people you love where they say something that blows your mind? How could they hold that? You suddenly see like this depth bottoms out in your relationship where you're like, holy cow, that's a gulf. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with that. And my friend said, when we hit this impasse, I think it's because you're pushing me somewhere. I'm just not going to go. I was like, yeah, I think that's right. And so in that moment, what does it mean to see with the whole eye? It means to hurt. It means to love. It means to not know which way to go. It means to say some things, and it means to not say other things. And it means to say, I love you, and end the conversation and start again another day. We're in relationship after all. That's how we begin, bit by bit, to tell the whole story. Not to know the story, but to tell it, bit by bit. And we have time for questions or comments. Yeah, Dave.
I couldn't help but think throughout this talk that as human beings, there's a very, at least to my mind, a very fundamental need to at once feel unique and special, but also to be part of a group that shares that uniqueness, if that makes sense. And a need to feel like, I'll say I instead of we, I am somehow privy to a truth that other people are not privy to, except for the ones who are also in it. And it's a very small and special group of people who understand this very basic truth. And to my mind, it almost seems like the content of that truth is secondary or even tertiary to that primary need to feel like I am somehow knowing something that other people are blind to. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on that.
It seems, the more I ponder this, it seems to me that a huge, huge part of this practice is owning up to my defensiveness. So my read of that, which I totally recognize. I mean, here we are. My family teases me about like our musketeer names. Myobun. Like we're a club, right, here in this hall. And like on some level, you could not to be disrespectful, not to disparage the triple treasure, but you could sort of see this in an uncompassionate light as any kind of community that's seeking together as a club that's like, haha, we're special. I sort of see it in a more self-compassionate way, I think, which is not so much that what we're clinging to is our specialness, but we're just really scared about loss of self and solidity. And so there's that otherism that we keep doing all the time, 100% of the time. And so then like, okay, there it is. So can I build into each breath, each moment, a willingness to ventilate the room that I'm trying to close up and just become as porous as I can. And that's, in my experience, it's incredibly, sometimes that's not so hard, but most of the time that's very painful work and requires, some fortitude. So having good friends to help us do that. And so those communities where people help each other be less defensive, that seems like a good way to work with this us-them kind of thing. And even to use our club names sometimes, I don't know, does that?
Oh, no, it's satisfactory, thank you.
Yeah.
So in that reading, one of the things that sticks out to me as far as the things I'm trying to feel in my life right now is how that seeing with the whole eye leads to the spontaneous action. Because I get so stuck in my seeing and thinking about my seeing that all of a sudden I just don't know what actual spontaneous action is. Like, where does that come from? What does that feel like? I don't know. Can you say more about that?
I feel like you asked the same question last week.
All the time.
So maybe right now your spontaneous action is asking this question.
Okay.
You know? I mean, we just keep bringing it forward, you know? And depending on our karma and our, you know, neurochemistry, whatever. I mean, we bring it forward in the shape that we bring it forward. And so for some of us that may look like questioning, and for some of us it may look like something else. But I think there's a lot of spontaneity happening.
I guess maybe a reflection more than a question. I grew up within a congregation, a Jewish congregation that was secular humanist, and the science was sort of essential to the sense of community and that kind of way of looking at the world. And I guess I see a lot of people in sort of a lot of liberals, to make it political because we started there, where that is kind of the foundation of how we understand ourselves. And to your question, I think for myself, it leads to a lot of overthinking. As opposed to being able to settle into that intuitive, inward looking place where I think there's a lot of truth that wasn't sort of valued in my upbringing. So I guess that's my reflection, but thank you for.
And I am not denigrating the scientific method.
Yeah.
Right? At all. So the question is, can we, with as much, I think this is where Hongxi with, you know, the upright cauldron and the backward step is pointing the way. Can we, with as much courage as possible, keep coming back to not knowing and to being present with all of the pieces? You know, I think that was what Bacon was trying to do, and that was also what Luther was trying to do. There's something in the path where it gets solidified into trying to hold the self and create this object that is where the suffering comes in. And then we end up in a world where we think we just can't talk to each other. And not to negate the fact of those gulfs and chasms, but to question, always question the narrative that keeps the self solid and the world out there. And so for some of us, that looks like regaining our intuition. For some of us, that may look like finding ways to bring critical thought and a broadened perspective on the world. For others of us, it may mean 1,000 different things. I always come back to Pema Chodron's metaphor of ventilation. I think I used that earlier, of the idea of how do we let more air and light into this framework of my life? How do we do that? Is the air coming in? Is the light coming in? Are we becoming more and more porous? So, yeah.
I just think of like that. If I can feel in that open space too, and then sometimes I'm triggered, right? And then my stuff comes up, and it's full of the baggage, right? It's not me, but it's the baggage, and then I'm overwhelmed by it and reacting from that. And then there's this place where I can be vulnerable and present, and then try to be honest with the people I'm in this space, right? And there's that line, like when to do it, how to do it, and like if I'm reacting and it's not a circumstance in which I can process it with people,
and but I'm so, you know what I mean? And it's like messy
Yeah.
and then vulnerable, and then you also don't want to burden others with it, right? There's these lines that are so. So I don't know what I'm asking, but it's just hard. It's hard to navigate that in moment by moment.
I'm nodding very vigorously. So, I mean, and this comes back, I think, Toshin comes back to your question too, because, I mean, this is, in our tradition, in Buddhism, this is the practice of ethics, of Shila, of ethical conduct. Like, it is just moment by moment, what do I do? Which is not about knowing. It's about the relationality of activity in the world, of this, which we perceive as being cause and effect. We perceive it as being linear, even if it's intercausal, as Shanae, our head student, is teaching us on Wednesday nights with the Avatamsaka Sutra class. We experience it as, I do this and then the world does this. It's so relational, but how do I live in that messy relational place? So that's the practice of Shila, the practice of ethics, ethical discipline, heroic conduct, lots of different translations for it. That's where the rubber meets the road. Right? Only we're the rubber and the road. So it's messy. Okay.